Yes, well, as Andrew was alluding to, last night I was able to sort of talk about high principles and the importance of maintaining those principles in what has been this dramatic changeover from the legacy media to the new media. What I can offer now is something a little bit more kind of on the ground experience. This is the sort of down and dirty of my personal experiences from going from a very successful legacy media outlet that suddenly hit hard times because of the changeover to digital to an organization that was literally founded on a digital platform as a response to the changes that have gone on in the profession. This is what most people ask me about these days. It's like, what did you learn in going to Politico from the Boston Globe, a very traditional newspaper, print-based, 135 or 40 years old by the time that I left, maybe 145 actually by the time that I left, to an organization that when I arrived was only 7 years old. So, and is now only 11 years old. So this is my personal journey and the advice, very practical advice that I can offer from moving from the legacy media to the new media. So the first scene that I'll set for you is in the year 2000. I was a young editor at the time. I was in charge of local coverage. I was the deputy managing editor. I felt very successful. I was in my 30s. And I finally had reached a level where I was invited to the sort of inner sanctum of the newspaper where they talked about the financial results and they set a strategy for the future. At that time, in the year 2000, the revenues of the Boston Globe and a couple of smaller papers that they owned totaled $660 million. The amount of that was profit was about $160 million. That was $160 million given every year to the New York Times company, which was then our owners. The profit margin, I think, was something like 24%. You can do the math yourself. But basically, a huge amount of money collected. And the contribution that I made at that time, when I was pointing out at that meeting, is I said, well, look, if we can raise this by, say, 4 percentage points, which would be another 10 million or 12 million or something, what if we gave half of that money back to the newsroom? That would be another 6 million. The way that we tabulated things, that's like 60 jobs. Or if we spent it a different way, we could open more foreign bureaus than the New York Times and become known as like the best source of international news in the country. It seemed like possibilities were endless. And the business people even were saying, well, you know, if we could expect that kind of an improvement next year, and they clearly thought it was coming, we could give that money back to the newsroom. Instead, what happened that year, later that year, was what became known in the United States as the dot-com crash. Boston had benefited disproportionately because there were a lot of high-tech companies in Boston. Suddenly revenue started moving down. So, you know, while in Robert's presentation, which this is sort of drawing on, he was talking about how 2008 was the time when the legacy media kind of realized the revenue streams weren't coming back. This was the first inkling that there may be very rocky times ahead. Now, let's flash forward another, let's say, 14 years after playing out a long editing career at the Boston Globe and coping every year with cutbacks to the point where the paper went from having 600 people roughly on the news staff to about 240 people on the news staff when I left and went to Politico. It was an entire culture change. You saw, among other things, the sort of psychic toll that goes along with all of that cutting. And I bet a lot of you in your own newsrooms have seen this. The financial problems, I think, were a little bit more dramatic in the United States than in Germany, simply because consumer revenue was always higher in Germany than in the United States. So the big ad crash, again, that we heard about earlier, hit the United States even worse than it hit German outlets. Nonetheless, I know that these are transatlantic trends, these are structural changes. Most of you have experienced the same thing that I did at the Boston Globe, but I never fully appreciated how much that kind of making do with less mentality kind of gets into your bones and sort of limits what you can do, until I sort of showed up at a newsroom that was actually about the same size, the newsroom for Politico in Washington. There's a Politico in Europe, obviously, and there's some other bureaus and things, but the number of editorial employees in Washington was about the same, 240, but it was a different 240 people. It was younger, it was people who grew up in a digital world, which I did not, people who had a kind of can-do spirit, people who had a spirit of experimentation, people who were willing to fail, people who were willing to try different things. And that was a tremendously eye-opening experience. So let me tell you just very quickly a little bit about the story behind Politico. Politico was founded by two former Washington Post editors working with the son of a longtime media properties owner, Robert Albritton. They founded it in 2007 and specifically wanted to be sort of the anti-newspaper. They wanted to be faster, they wanted to be shorter, they wanted to communicate information in a more direct sort of way than newspapers did. And frankly, as somebody who at that time, I was the Washington bureau chief for the Boston Globe, sort of gazing over and saying, what the hell is this that they're starting? I was very suspicious of it. It felt a little bit like dumbing down. It also felt like they were kind of climbing over the corpses of a lot of the journalists who'd been laid off in Washington and stuff to try to create this new thing. But it really, really did catch on. And when you think about it, the wave that they caught was so silly and so obvious, because back in 2007 and 2008, we would always hold our best stories for the print edition in the morning, right? So you had a great story, or you knew something really important, it happened the night before. We were saving it for a print edition. Politico would go ahead and just put it online the night before and get credit for these amazing scoops. And I, working for another outlet, I was kind of like, wait, we all knew that. Why is Politico getting credit for this scoop? But they did, and people really seemed to respond to that quick news. We're telling you what's happening, we're telling you what's happening behind the scenes, and we're telling it to you first. So Politico got a lot of credit, a lot of mileage from that. Also, in a way that, looking at it from the outside, seemed a little unfair and a little surprising, because it was a web-first organization, and because it had a futuristic-sounding name, and because people viewed it as something that was a promising startup, it began to attract much more popular attention. So, like a lot of editors, I would go to various journalism conferences and things like that and talk about the worthy Boston Globe. And I remember one at a university talking about the Boston Globe, and it wasn't Politico. There was actually a failed startup in San Diego that somebody was talking about. And I was amazed. We had people from the Wall Street Journal, we had people from the Washington Post, we had people from the Boston Globe, and we had people from this startup in San Diego that I can't even remember the name of. And at the end of the conference, the journalists, the students, the journalism students were all congregating around that failed startup. They were not even considering going to the Boston Globe. Well, Politico managed to take that reputation and eventually monetize it. And I'll tell you a little bit how they did it. Talking about developing an enthusiastic audience and things, they developed a discrete audience of people who are sort of politically engaged customers. Most of them, I shouldn't say most of them, many of them are in Washington and the Washington suburbs. And as we learned in the earlier presentation, they represent a core. They're the people that we want to serve the most, the politically activated movers and shakers there in Washington. But there are also many like-minded readers around the country and around the world who also will log on to Politico. So traffic was growing very quickly. But traffic, as we've heard earlier too, you can't monetize just a big, giant number of uniques. What you need is a dedicated audience who's willing to pay for it. And also, in the case of Politico, frankly, sponsors who are willing to, wanting to reach that audience and who will pay a premium to reach that audience. These are not consumer clicks. This is not looking for the Google crowd. They want to advertise on a site that is read by the movers and shakers in the United States. So the highest priority for Politico then and Politico now is to make sure that Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer and Paul Ryan and people in the White House are reading Politico, because the sponsors will come because they want to reach that audience. Now, subscription revenue is very, very important. But rather than put a paywall on the main site, Politico determined to use the main site almost as a marketing tool itself to build the reputation of the organization, and then created verticals that were in 14 different policy areas for which they charge a very high subscription fee. I mean, high by consumer standards, but we're talking several $1,000s. It differs from specialty to specialty, where companies that were interested in doing business in Washington could subscribe for insider information behind the paywall and have all of their employees get this service. So the subscription rate may be $3,000, $4,000, $5,000, even $5,000, but the number of people that would get it under that subscription is more like several hundred. So it seems a little more cost effective from a business point of view when you think about all the people benefiting from that information. Happily for Politico, that business has taken off and now represents more than half the revenue that Politico has. In just a period of 5 years, it has taken off to that point, and it's now more than half the revenue that Politico has. Separately, Politico started an events business. And this is one where the disparity between the Boston Globe and Politico was also very visible. You know, we would do events up in Boston, even events that were in areas that should be of strong interest to sponsors, such as financial services, which is very, very big in Boston. But we couldn't get sponsors. Politico would get sponsors from some of those same financial services companies for events in Washington. Again, because people saw it as a futuristic brand. They wanted to be associated with it. It seemed to attract young people. It attracted more energy. It attracted more people viewed, unfortunately, the Boston Globe as being a newspaper for older adults and people who were born and raised in Boston and had a sort of discrete set of interests and weren't making new consumer choices and weren't. I think that's a little bit unfair, and I can certainly argue it for both sides, and I have loyalty on both sides, but that is just simply the fact. The events business is now a very significant part of Politico's revenue stream, maybe 10%. That's significant. They probably get the most events revenue in Washington in what's become an increasingly powerful, an increasingly large field. When Politico started doing events, there was very little competition. Now, the Washington Post does events, the Wall Street Journal does events. There are many, many outlets and many organizations. All the magazines do events and try to do sponsored events. But you would be surprised for a conference that would be about the size of this and probably less comprehensive, fewer speakers, less time. You'd be surprised how much companies would be willing to pay to sponsor it in feeling like they will get the benefit of that association with Politico. So the recipe there has been, the main site has continued to grow. It has built the reputation of Politico, and that reputation has been forward-looking and appealing to younger people, and that has helped bring in revenue both through the subscription side for the specialized sites and for the events business. The final piece of the puzzle is advertising and sponsorships, which tend to go up and down depending a lot on what's going on in Congress. But it still remains a very significant part of the revenue stream. Now, what are the lessons that came from this experience that I could offer back to the Boston Globe, which I still respect? My colleagues do outstanding work. It's a vital institution. It's terrific. It has some financial challenges. One thing I would say is that news brands need to revitalize themselves to some extent. There was a thinking in the newsroom when I was in Boston that, you know, we serve a core local market, so provide unique content. And in that case, the unique content was crime coverage. It was very local politics. It was very things. I always felt then, and I feel 100 times more strongly now that I've been at Politico, that that can be a mistake because you become the newspaper of a small group of people who are very, very rooted in that community. In a place like Boston, there's a different truth for every community, by the way, but a place like Boston does attract a lot of people and ever more people moving in. I don't think there was enough in the Boston Globe that appealed to them. So if you were to go back and say, how do you revitalize this brand, you would have to look at the things that are of importance to people in Boston and are also important to people nationally. Things like medicine, financial services, tech and tech education, particularly with MIT, sports. These are all opportunities not just for an older journalistic brand to reach new readers. their own readers in their own community coming to work in those industries, but it's a chance to develop national expertise and to create verticals, perhaps like the verticals that Politico has, which could provide extra subscription revenue and extra advertising revenue. So I think it was a mistake at the Boston Globe to go too local, too community-oriented in its coverage and ignore the fact that a big part of the community were people who were working in these nationally significant industries. So you'll say, okay, well, what about other local newspapers? They may not have quite the same national connection that a large metropolitan area like Boston would have. But I would say, you know, you can pick any place, and there are things that are larger. You know, Angie works for a paper that was in St. Petersburg and Tampa, Florida, and you think, well, what are some of the drivers in that economy? Well, the military is one. They have the CENTCOM office down in that area. Cuban Americans are a large thing. You know, you've got the retirement industry and real estate and stuff, which is enormous in that area, in a high growth area. Those are ways to reach people who are moving to those areas, but also to perhaps create verticals that reach an even larger audience. You know, people who share the mindset of Tampa and St. Petersburg, even if they don't live there, like military families who may have lived there for a short period of time and be living somewhere else. So I think that is very, very important on top of things. So finally, once you've revitalized that older brand, how are you going to sell it? Now, this is an area which is not my expertise at all, but I'll give you one more anecdote. I remember many years ago, when I was like a teenager or something, telling my parents, like, why can't we get cable television? We'll get more channels, we'll do all that. And I remember my parents made almost like a little morality issue out of it. Maybe some of you went through this, where they were like, we will not pay for cable television. We're already getting the 3 channels that we need. This is the whole thing. Well, flash forward another, 25 years or so, and I got a call from my mother, now aging mother, or whatever, who was deeply concerned. She said she had to tell me she was deeply concerned about something. And I said, well, what is it? She said, you don't watch enough television. You didn't even have a television at your home the last time I saw you. And I was like, well, life is too busy. You don't want to sit down and watch television. And she started talking about all of the channels they get on cable and all of these specialty channels that they're paying for and all the things that I'm missing out. Clearly, she felt that it was a sign of some encroaching eccentricity or something that I wasn't participating in cable. So the world has completely changed. My parents are now willing to pay for entertainment, to put down that credit card, to go through the difficult e-commerce of getting it all done. And that's been played out in the tremendous rise now for entertainment on Amazon and for entertainment on Netflix. It seems to me that there's some benefit in there for the news business, that people who are willing to go onto those sites, pay $5 to get to download the movie, ought to be willing to go and pay $5 to download a vertical or a piece of news or a subscription product that they find relevant and appealing to them. So that's my advice for my former beloved employer, the Boston Globe, which I believe will have a great future if it makes some of these changes. That's also what I've learned through Politico, which has really revived my faith in a lot of ways in journalism. It's not, the straightest path you could imagine, but it shows that when there's a willingness to innovate and there's a brand that attracts innovation-oriented people, you can make some significant strides and create an organization that really embraces the future. Thank you.